In the spring of 1811, as laborers tore down an aging tobacco warehouse in Richmond, Virginia, they stumbled upon a discovery that would cast a shadow over the city for generations to come. Beneath the rotted floorboards lay 8 identical wooden boxes. Inside each rested a man's wedding ring and a small vial filled with what seemed to be medicinal powder. The names inscribed on those rings were all different, the dates too, but every single one of them traced back to the same chilling figure. They had belonged to the husbands of Ruth Holloway, a woman who, against all odds, had outlived 8 wealthy men in just 3 decades. And what investigators discovered in those vials would forever alter the way they remembered this refined widow, once celebrated as the darling of Virginia's high society. The local magistrate, fearing scandal that could destroy prominent families, ordered the matter sealed away, locked deep in official archives. For over 200 years, this story has slept in silence within the records of the Virginia Historical Society. But tonight, we're unlocking that silence and revisiting the truth behind one of America's most methodical and most terrifying killers. Before we sink deeper into Ruth Holloway's deadly marriages, I want to bring you into this story. If you enjoy exploring America's hidden and haunted history, go ahead and subscribe. It helps us keep unearthing stories like this one. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I love seeing how far these mysteries travel. Now Ruth's tale begins not with murder, but with loss. Loss that would ripple outward and shape the fates of 8 men. Virginia in 1780 was a land transformed by revolution, yet haunted by the ruins it left behind. Along the fertile James River near Richmond and Petersburg, grand tobacco plantations rose in shining white columns, monuments to newfound prosperity. The Revolutionary War had ended only 3 years earlier, but its wounds still ran deep. Loyalist estates had been seized and redistributed, creating new fortunes for some, while leaving others destitute. It was into this world of shifting fortunes and concealed betrayals that Ruth Holloway appeared. She arrived in Richmond in the autumn of 1782, a striking woman of 28 with auburn hair and eyes the color of winter fog. She claimed to be the widow of Captain Jonathan Holloway, a Continental officer said to have perished at Yorktown. Her story was simple, yet deeply tragic. She had lost everything in the war and sought to begin again in Virginia, drawn by whispers of prosperity and promises of kindness. What set Ruth apart was not only her beauty, but her intelligence and refinement. She carried the cadence of an educated New Englander, could read Latin, and possessed a keen knowledge of medicinal herbs. In a time when doctors were scarce and medicine primitive, her skills made her invaluable to Richmond's elite. She kept with her a leather-bound journal, filled with herbal remedies she claimed were passed down through generations of her family. Soon the gentry of Virginia embraced her. The war had thinned the ranks of eligible women. Disease displacement and flight with loyalist families had taken their toll. Ruth, with her polished manners and her gift for healing, was welcomed with open arms. Within months, she had established herself on Clay Street, in a modest but respectable home, supporting herself by treating ailments from consumption to nervous disorders. But beneath Richmond's polite facades, darker currents stirred. The revolution had not only forged heroes, it had also enriched profiteers and traitors. In hushed drawing rooms, people whispered of men who had changed allegiances for gold of supply caravans, ambushed by those who knew their routes of patriot leaders betrayed to the enemy. Some even suspected a secret cabal had conspired with the British. But evidence was scarce, and the men whispered about had not merely survived the war, they had prospered from it. Their treachery had been rewarded handsomely with confiscated loyalist estates, with lucrative government contracts, with fortunes built upon betrayal. And it was in this glittering but tainted world that Ruth Holloway began her deadly dance with Virginia's most prominent men. She possessed an almost unearthly magnetism. Tobacco merchants, shipping magnates, land speculators, even political figures all seemed to drift inevitably into her orbit. Each was captivated, each succumbed to her charm, each married her with ceremony and splendor. And then each died. Their ends, though suspicious to modern eyes, passed without alarm in their own time. The first whispers of unease did not come from the salons of Richmond, but from its back corridors among the enslaved people who worked in those great houses. They muttered of strange patterns, masters who soon after marriage were struck by stomach pains, then weakness, then death. But in a society where their testimony carried no weight, their voices were brushed aside as superstition or envy. The first husband fell scarcely 6 months after the wedding bells. It was a stifling August night in 1783 when Colonel Edmund Fairfax, a vigorous man of 45 and one of Richmond's most successful tobacco merchants, was found lifeless in his study. He had shown no signs of frailty, yet by dawn on August 15th, he was gone. It was Jupiter, a trusted servant, who found him. Later, in whispered retellings to other enslaved workers, he described what he had seen and heard on that final night. His words would never reach white ears, but they survived in shadowed memory. Around midnight, Jupiter had stirred awake. From the study came not the gentle clink of brandy glasses or the rustle of papers, but something far more unsettling. A low groan, followed by the scrape of a chair. Slipping to the window, he peered inside. There was his master, doubled over the desk, face twisted in agony, one hand clutching his stomach. And beside him, calm as ever, stood Mrs. Ruth, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. In her other hand, a steaming cup. "Drink this, my dear Edmund." She cooed, her voice soft as velvet. "It will ease the pain. I prepared it with special care." Jupiter watched the colonel lift his head, sweat beading across his ashen face despite the cool night air. His voice cracked with desperation. "The pain, it's worse. Perhaps we should call Dr. Harrison." But Ruth's hand pressed gently, firmly against him. "Nonsense, darling. Dr. Harrison is miles away. And besides, this remedy has been trusted in my family for generations. Trust me." Her words sang with the same melodic cadence that had enchanted Richmond society. Yet Jupiter caught another note beneath it. A hard edge, an insistence that brooked no refusal. The colonel drank. Within moments, his groans deepened. His body convulsed once, twice, then fell forward, crashing onto the desk in a scatter of papers and ink. Ruth did not move. She stood there still as a portrait, gazing down at her husband. Only after a long pause did she act washing the cup meticulously in a basin of water already prepared before finally unleashing her screams for help. At dawn, Dr. Harrison arrived. He found Ruth collapsed in grief, clutching her husband's body, her sobs echoing through the room. To the doctor, the symptoms she described: violent stomach pain, sudden collapse, suggested nothing more than acute gastric distress, a commonplace fate in Virginia, where spoiled food and impure water claimed many lives. He recorded the cause as gastric fever and offered his condolences to the inconsolable widow. What Dr. Harrison never knew, what Ruth had counted upon, was that her knowledge of medicine was not rooted in family lore, but in something far darker. On her journey south, Ruth had lingered in Philadelphia, where she grew close to a disgraced physician, Dr. Marcus Wainwright. Wainwright had been cast out of practice for his dangerous experiments with plant extracts, experiments designed not to heal, but to kill without trace. His notes, never published, described native plants whose toxins could mimic the symptoms of common illnesses, leaving no evidence behind. Ruth not only absorbed his methods, she perfected them. Through experimentation, she discovered that by blending tiny amounts of these alkaloids with familiar herbs, she could create mixtures that soothed in small doses but became lethal in larger measures. Her leather-bound journal, carried everywhere, did not contain family remedies at all. It was a book of poisons, carefully crafted formulas for death disguised as medicine. Colonel Fairfax's funeral drew the cream of Richmond society. Ruth played her role to perfection, swooning at the graveside, collapsing into the arms of sympathetic friends, her veil damp with tears. To all who saw her, she was the very image of a heartbroken widow. But beneath that veil, a far colder plan was already taking shape. The colonel's will, drawn hastily, just weeks after his marriage, secured Ruth a fortune, the Clay Street house land holdings, and a generous sum in gold. Yet her grief, so convincing at the graveside, proved remarkably short-lived. Barely 3 months after Colonel Fairfax was laid to rest, Ruth was seen walking arm in arm with another man of prominence, Captain William Randolph. A celebrated shipping magnate, Randolph had earned his fortune ferrying supplies to the Continental Army during the Revolution. To those who murmured about the unseemly haste of Ruth's new attachment, the answer was simple. A woman alone in the world required protection. And Randolph was known throughout Virginia as a man of honor and substance. What none of her admirers realized was that Ruth did not choose her husbands by chance. Each man she pursued shared a hidden bond. All had once belonged to a clandestine circle that supplied intelligence to the British during the war. Colonel Fairfax had been their treasurer, the man who handled the flow of British gold to American traitors. Ruth's chance arrival in Richmond and her carefully chosen romances were not the whims of a lonely widow. They were the opening moves in a slow and deliberate game of vengeance, one that would consume 8 men before it was through. Captain Randolph's fate came swiftly. Married to Ruth in January of 1784, he was dead by autumn. A man of iron constitution, known to weather brutal Atlantic storms with ease, he crumbled within 3 days to violent stomach pain, weakness, and collapse. Once again, Dr. Harrison arrived, and once again the diagnosis was ordinary bilious fever. By this time, Jupiter had been sold to another household. But the enslaved of Richmond carried their own web of communication. News of the second husband's sudden illness spread quickly. Whispers deepened into warnings. In the Randolph home, an older servant named Caesar began to notice unsettling details. His master's illness followed the taking of medicinal tea prepared solely by Ruth. Her calm, almost detached demeanor while others panicked. Her firm insistence that no other physician be summoned, and then Caesar made a discovery. While cleaning the captain's study after his death, he found a small vial, tucked behind a loose board in the wall. The powder inside was pale, fine, with the faint scent of almonds and bitter herbs. When he met Jupiter in the Richmond market, Caesar showed him the vial. Jupiter's face drained of color. "Same thing I seen at Colonel Fairfax's house," he whispered urgently, eyes darting to see if anyone was listening. "Found one just like it in the kitchen after the master died. Showed it to the cook, and she made me throw it in the river. Told me never to speak of it." From that moment, the enslaved began keeping their own quiet record, passing notes and warnings across kitchens, markets, and fields. They pieced together the pattern. Ruth always insisted on preparing her husband's medicines herself. She kept her supplies under lock and key, never letting servants handle them. She roamed the forests outside Richmond alone, returning with baskets of herbs that she guarded with jealous secrecy. The pattern was undeniable. But in a world where their words carried no power, the truth could only live in whispers. Meanwhile, Ruth's stature in society grew with every death. Captain Randolph's will left her richer still, and the community, blinded by sympathy, praised her resilience. Here was a woman, twice widowed, yet carrying herself with grace. She was invited into the finest parlors, welcomed as both a tragic figure and a captivating guest. And so cloaked in pity and surrounded by admirers, Ruth set her sights on her third husband, Judge Thomas Henley. A man of influence, a prominent voice in the House of Delegates, and an architect of Virginia's young legal system. Their courtship was swift, their passion undeniable. To the judge, Ruth was nothing less than salvation proof that love could bloom even after the devastation of war. But to Ruth, he was not salvation. He was the next piece on the board. The wedding of Ruth Holloway and Judge Thomas Henley in June of 1785 was the talk of Richmond society, a dazzling ceremony that symbolized wealth, power, and new beginnings. Yet behind the grandeur lurked the shadow of Ruth's design. Henley would not live to see another spring. 7 months later, in January 1786, the judge collapsed in the midst of a glittering dinner party attended by a dozen of Virginia's most prominent men. Only minutes before, he had been the very image of vigor, laughing, toasting, recounting stories of constitutional debates and his vision for the Commonwealth's future. Then Ruth offered him a special digestive tonic, a family recipe she claimed her mother once prepared for her father. Within an hour, the judge was pale sweating, clutching his stomach. Guests rushed to his aid, but his decline was swift and merciless. Dr. Harrison was summoned for the third time to the bedside of one of Ruth's husbands. His suspicions, now gnawing at the edges of reason, whispered that this was no act of fate. But suspicion alone was powerless. Ruth had witnesses. She had never been alone with her husband. Her grief was convincing, and the symptoms could be explained by any number of natural ailments. And who would dare accuse a woman so respected, so admired of murder, without undeniable proof? The cycle continued. One by one, her husbands fell like dominoes. George Carrington, a wealthy planter, died in 1787 of acute dyspepsia. Samuel Bradford, a prosperous merchant, perished in 1788 of nervous fever. Edward Custis, a banker, collapsed in 1789 from what was called gastric apoplexy. Each death richer than the last. Each funeral more dramatic than before. Each new courtship drawing murmurs of disbelief that such tragedy could strike the same woman again and again. But by the death of Custis, the pattern began to gleam in the shadows, at least for those who knew where to look. For Ruth was not acting alone. In late 1789, a familiar figure resurfaced: Dr. Marcus Wainwright, the disgraced Philadelphia physician who had once taught Ruth the darker uses of medicine. He arrived in Richmond under the guise of a man seeking redemption, renting a small house on the town's edge. But Caesar, the ever-watchful servant, noticed Ruth's frequent visits to Wainwright's home. Always at dusk, always departing long after nightfall. What Caesar could not know was that Wainwright had uncovered Ruth's true identity and her purpose. He did not seek to stop her, but to profit from her crimes. Their arrangement was simple. He supplied her with new formulas, deadlier and subtler than before, and she rewarded him with a share of each inheritance. Yet, Wainwright's greed blinded him. He mistook Ruth's vengeance for avarice. He imagined they might expand their work to other cities, that together they could build an empire of quiet deaths. He failed to see that Ruth's fury was not fueled by gold, but by justice against those who had betrayed her first husband. Justice that would end only when her list of traitors was complete. And now, only two names remained. Dr. Harrison himself, the physician who had once shielded their treasonous circle, and at the very top, Governor Edmund Randolph, the statesman who had orchestrated it all. But fate had prepared an obstacle. In the autumn of 1790, a new figure entered Richmond, Captain Jonathan Hale, a former Continental intelligence officer whose sharp mind had been honed in the shadows of wartime espionage. Officially, he came to mediate disputes over confiscated Loyalist property. Unofficially, he was tracking whispers of a secret organization that had sold America's lifeblood to the British. What he found in Richmond chilled him. One by one, suspected traitors had died, all under mysterious circumstances and all connected to one woman. Unlike the local elite blind to coincidence, Hale's training taught him to see patterns in the chaos. His first clue came over dinner with Dr. Harrison. The physician, weary from years of attending the same grim spectacle, confided his unease. Most peculiar, he admitted, eyes heavy with doubt. Mrs. Holloway suffers the most dreadful luck with husbands, yet she is always so devoted, so careful in their treatment, as though she were trying to save them rather than... He stopped short, unable to voice what trembled at his lips. Hale leaned closer. Rather than what, doctor? Harrison's hand tightened around his glass. Forgive me. I should not speak ill of a woman who has borne such terrible losses. Only, in 30 years of practice, I have never witnessed so many similar deaths in one household. That night, Captain Hale began his own investigation into Ruth Holloway. What he uncovered in the weeks that followed would freeze the blood in his veins. There was no trace of a Captain Jonathan Holloway in any Continental Army record. No such officer had fallen at Yorktown or perished in any other battle. The identity Ruth had so carefully woven was nothing but a fiction, a mask that concealed a past even more dangerous than anyone in Richmond suspected. Her origins were a void, her true story a mystery buried deep beneath the ashes of war. Meanwhile, Ruth's sights had fixed upon her seventh victim, Alexander Fitzhugh Virginia's merchant prince. Wealthy beyond imagination, respected beyond reproach, and secretly fatally bound to the covenant of prosperity. During the Revolution, Fitzhugh had sold his countrymen's lives for British gold, providing enemy forces with intelligence on American convoys. Countless patriots had died because of him. Her approach was by now perfected. In the winter of 1790, Ruth cast herself once again as the vulnerable widow, a woman wounded by cruel fate, yet remarkably skilled in the language of finance. Fitzhugh, himself a widower, was ensnared within months. By March of 1791, he had pledged himself to her in marriage. But this time, Ruth's web quivered. Captain Jonathan Hale had begun whispering his suspicions into the ears of Richmond's elite. When Fitzhugh announced the engagement, his friends gathered in quiet alarm. Alexander warned Robert Carter at the Richmond Club 7 husbands, 7 sudden deaths. Even if chance is the culprit, can such coincidence be ignored? Fitzhugh, bewitched by Ruth's brilliance, dismissed them. Gentlemen, you rely on gossip. Magistrates and physicians have examined her time and again. She is guiltless. Shall we condemn a woman simply because tragedy has haunted her doorstep? But Fitzhugh was not the only one under scrutiny. In his desperation for leverage, Dr. Marcus Wainwright had been prying into Ruth's victims. He uncovered the truth that every death tied back to the covenant of prosperity. And in his greed, he tried to use this knowledge against her. On a freezing night in February 1791, Wainwright's body was discovered in his home. The cause a lethal dose of his own experimental elixirs. The magistrates called it suicide. Ruth wore solemn black at his funeral, masking the quiet relief that burned beneath her veil. With Wainwright gone, the last man who could trace her poisons to their source was silent forever. Her hands were untied. Her mission could proceed without hindrance. On March 15, 1791, Ruth wed Alexander Fitzhugh in a subdued ceremony. Among the guests was Captain Hale, watching her with the cold patience of a hunter who knew the trap was nearly sprung. If she was indeed guilty, she was flawless in disguise, every gesture tender, every smile perfectly timed. 4 months later, Fitzhugh was dead. His illness began with a twist of pain in the stomach, then spread like fire until his body collapsed entirely. Dr. Harrison, now deeply troubled, conducted the most thorough examination of his career. Yet even he found no evidence to satisfy the law. In private, he was certain Alexander Fitzhugh had been murdered. Ruth's performance at the funeral was her grandest yet. She fainted, sobbed, secluded herself for weeks, her grief a mask polished to perfection. But behind the curtain, something had shifted. Her mourning gave way to a chilling confidence. She no longer clung to the guise of a helpless widow. She strode like a queen. She was, by fortune and inheritance, one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. More importantly, she had toppled 7 of the 8 pillars of the covenant. Only one remained, Dr. Harrison himself. Yet, Ruth did not see that Captain Hale was closing in. His search had led him to a trove of captured British files. Within them, he uncovered a name that made his blood run cold, a woman known only as the widow, a phantom who had once moved through America's secret war in the shadows of espionage. And now he understood. The widow was not a rumor. She was standing before him draped in black silk, hiding in plain sight as Ruth Holloway, the figure known only as the widow, was no patriot avenger. She was something far more dangerous. Captain Hale's research revealed the truth. Jonathan Holloway had been real, yet not as Ruth claimed. He was no fallen Continental officer, but a British spy captured and executed in 1779 after being betrayed by his own comrades. Betrayed not to the British, but to the Americans. Those who exposed him would later form the Covenant of Prosperity, erasing a rival who knew too much about their treason. Ruth's campaign was not vengeance for a patriot wronged. It was retribution for a British agent, the man she had loved and lost. Every husband, every calculated death had been part of her war against those who had doomed him. Far from avenging America, she was striking down its hidden defenders. Her mission was not justice, it was treason, and now she was reaching higher than ever before. Her final target was not Dr. Harrison, as Hale had assumed, but Governor Edmund Randolph himself, Virginia's most powerful man-architect of the Constitution and secret master of the Covenant of Prosperity. Ruth wove her net with uncharacteristic subtlety. She did not present herself as a fragile widow this time, but as an equal and independent woman of influence, fluent in politics, indispensable to a man whose ambitions stretched beyond the governor's mansion. Randolph was shrewd, tested by the fires of revolution and intrigue. If any man could pierce Ruth's disguise, it was him. But Ruth possessed a weapon deadlier than poison knowledge. She knew his true history, that his treachery had never been born of ideology, but of ambition. He had betrayed the revolution when he thought it doomed, then betrayed the British when victory turned toward the Patriots. His loyalty was only to himself, and Ruth knew it. When the governor's wife succumbed to illness in the spring of 1792, Ruth played her part flawlessly. She attended the funeral with immaculate decorum, then withdrew into mourning, leaving Richmond society whispering at her refinement. But behind the curtain, her approach tightened. Randolph was now unencumbered, and Ruth was positioned perfectly at his side. Captain Hale, realizing the danger, made one last attempt. He secured a private audience and laid out his evidence: the fabricated identity, the trail of poisoned husbands, the secret society bound to Ruth's victims. He urged Randolph to see the widow's hand before it was too late. But Hale's warning backfired. Randolph was not horrified, he was fascinated. To him, Ruth was no monster but a weapon. 7 men dead, each eliminated without evidence left behind. A woman who could kill under the eyes of physicians and magistrates, yet emerge with her reputation burnished. She was not a threat to be crushed, she was an asset to be cultivated. Captain Hale Randolph said calmly, "If Mrs. Holloway has rid Virginia of traitors, then perhaps she has done this state a service. You call her dangerous. I call her useful." Hale left that meeting with a gnawing dread. He had not saved the governor. He had delivered Ruth directly into the halls of power. The implications were chilling. If Ruth Holloway and Governor Randolph joined forces, they could wield death itself as a political weapon, shielded by the machinery of state power. But what Hale did not know, Randolph already had. His network of spies had uncovered Ruth's true past. The wife of Jonathan Holloway, the executed British agent betrayed by his own conspirators. Randolph knew she was not simply hunting traitors, she was hunting him, and instead of fleeing, he invited her to dinner. The evening was staged like a courtship candlelight and fine wine. But in Randolph's private study, pretenses were stripped away. Mrs. Holloway, the governor, said smoothly, or perhaps I should say, the widow of Jonathan Holloway executed for treason in 1779, let us speak without masks. Ruth's hand drifted toward the vial of poison hidden in her reticule. But Randolph only watched her with a thin smile, his eyes glittering with cold amusement. I know you have slain 7 men of the covenant, he continued, and I know you believe me, the 8th, your final quarry. But you are mistaken. There were not 8 members, there were 9. The words struck her like a dagger. For years, she had believed her vengeance complete, her husband's betrayers nearly all accounted for. Now Randolph told her there remained one more. Who, she whispered. Randolph leaned forward, savoring the moment. Captain Jonathan Hale. The very man chasing you now. He was the Covenant's analyst. He uncovered your husband's duplicity, marked him as a liability, and recommended his elimination. He hunts you not for justice, but to bury his own guilt. The revelation twisted the story upon itself. Hale, the relentless pursuer, the voice of justice, was himself part of the treason Ruth had sworn to avenge. Randolph mistook Ruth's silence for hesitation. You see, my dear, we need one another. You possess knowledge that could destroy me, and I you. Together we could reshape Virginia. You call it vengeance. I call it power. But Ruth's mind was already made up. You ask for alliance, she said evenly, though her pulse hammered in her throat. Yet, you betrayed my husband. You betrayed the British. You betrayed even your own conspirators. Tell me, Governor, why should I believe you would not betray me as well? Randolph reclined in his chair, calm, calculating, certain he held the advantage. Because, Mrs. Holloway, we are bound by mutual destruction. Expose me and you fall. Expose you and I fall. That is the bond of power. But Ruth's grey eyes had hardened to steel. Randolph had miscalculated. She needed no bond, no alliance, no partner. His words had given her what she craved most: confirmation. Confirmation of the 9th betrayer, Captain Jonathan Hale. Her mission was not over, and now it would end in blood. There would be no alliance, no future, only death. What followed was a sinister duel in shadows, a game of predator and prey that stretched across the sweltering weeks of summer 1792. Ruth appeared to accept Governor Randolph's bargain, even as she quietly devised a way to kill both him and Captain Hale. Randolph, smug in his belief that he had tamed her, envisioned using her as a disposable blade. And Hale, oblivious to the fact that his own betrayal had been uncovered, pressed forward with his investigation. Unaware he was walking into a trap set by 2 of the deadliest players in Virginia. The stage for their collision was set on the night of August 15th, 1792, 9 years to the day since Colonel Fairfax's death. Ruth invited both men to a private dinner at her mansion. She called it a business discussion. In truth, it was an execution ground. Randolph accepted, convinced he commanded the game. Hale accepted, eager to prove Ruth's guilt. And Ruth, smiling as she opened her doors, believed both men were already doomed. The dinner unfolded with flawless civility. Candlelight gleamed on polished silver. Conversation drifted from politics to trade, from war memories to the promise of Virginia's future. Yet beneath the refined words lay an electric silence, each guest waiting, calculating, plotting the perfect moment to strike. Ruth's plan was her masterpiece. No single toxin this time, but a symphony of death. For Randolph, a slow-acting potion of foxglove and hemlock, hidden in a rare French brandy. Hours later, his heart would fail. His death dismissed as the natural fate of a statesman under too much strain. For Hale, a subtler fate. The rim of his wineglass coated with a contact poison. Invisible, tasteless, it would seep through his skin bloom in his veins and strike him down hours later. Far from Ruth's house, no traceable link to her hospitality. It was perfect, elegant, unassailable. But Ruth had not anticipated that Randolph already knew. His informants had uncovered her journal, her purchases of strange herbs, her midnight wanderings into abandoned buildings. He came to her table armed not with weapons, but with knowledge, and knowledge could kill as surely as poison. As the servants cleared the first course, the atmosphere sharpened. "I have always believed," Ruth said coolly, her eyes flicking between the two men, "that betrayal demands reckoning, no matter how many years have passed." Randolph's thin smile cut through the candlelight. "Justice delayed is not justice denied, Mrs. Holloway. Delay can make the reckoning more complete." Hale shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing. "Revenge," he said cautiously, "however justified it might feel, consumes not only its target, but the soul of the avenger. That is why law exists, so that justice is not taken by the hands of the wronged." Ruth's lips curled into a cold smile. "But Captain, what happens when law itself is corrupted? When the guilty sit upon the very thrones of justice? Then vengeance is not only justified, it is the only justice left." It was then that Hale's face changed. His hand, still resting on the poisoned glass, trembled slightly. The truth struck him like a thunderclap. He was not simply a guest at Ruth Holloway's table. He was prey. The philosophical discussion was not abstract. It was Ruth's measured way of explaining why she intended to kill him. His hand twitched toward his coat where a pistol rested, but Governor Randolph's warning glance froze him in place. Any sudden move would seal his fate. "Gentlemen," Ruth said at last, rising with unhurried grace, "I believe it's time we retire to the library for brandy and for honest conversation. I have something special to share with you both." They followed her in silence, each step heavy with the knowledge that they were walking into the final act of a deadly drama that had been unfolding for over a decade. Ruth deliberately placed herself between the men and the only exit, blocking the most obvious escape. Governor Randolph noticed the tactic but dismissed it. Convinced he could still outmaneuver a woman he had long considered useful but ultimately disposable. Captain Hale, by contrast, knew the danger clearly now. Every nerve in his body calculated the odds of survival should he attempt a desperate strike. The library was a stage of Ruth's choosing, perfect for what she intended. Heavy curtains smothered the windows, swallowing sound from the street. The servants had been dismissed hours earlier, and the room prepared in advance contained everything she would need to conceal two deaths and craft explanations, convincing enough to silence suspicion. Now then, Ruth said as she moved to the sideboard, gleaming with crystal decanters. I promised you both honesty, and I intend to keep that promise. Her gaze lingered first on Randolph. Governor, you believe you have molded me into your assassin? Then she turned to Hale. And you, Captain, believe you have gathered enough evidence to bring charges against me for the deaths of my 8 husbands. She smiled faintly, lifting 2 glasses of amber brandy. You are both correct and yet fatally wrong in your assumptions about what I intend to do with this knowledge. She faced them squarely. The truth is simple. Neither of you will leave this room alive tonight. Governor Randolph, you will die because you led the conspiracy that murdered my husband. Captain Hale, you will die because you were the analyst who marked him as a liability. 13 years I have waited for this moment. Tonight, my justice is complete. Randolph's composure cracked. His voice, edged with desperation, broke the silence. Mrs. Holloway, you underestimate the consequences of murdering a sitting governor. My death will not be hidden. You cannot simply add me to your collection of victims and expect to slip free. Ruth laughed, a low, amused sound, rich with contempt. Governor, I have already killed 8 prominent men without serious suspicion falling on me. I have amassed wealth, secured my place in the highest ranks of society, and eliminated nearly all of my enemies while wearing the mask of a grieving widow. Sympathetic, protected, untouchable. What makes you think your death or the captain's will be any more difficult to explain away? At that, Captain Hale finally acted. His military instinct overrode shock, pushing him to strike rather than flee. He lunged toward Ruth, aiming to wrest the glass from her hand before she could deliver its poison. But Ruth had anticipated him. She hurled the contents of one glass into his face. The liquid was not poison, but a caustic irritant drawn from Virginia plants that burned the eyes and blinded its victim in agony. Hale staggered back, clutching his face, his screams muffled by the curtain's weight. From beneath her shawl, Ruth drew a pistol slim, gleaming once belonging to a former victim. She leveled it with steady precision. Seizing what he thought was his chance, Randolph rushed her. But he had badly misjudged her strength and her readiness. With a dancer's fluidity, Ruth pivoted, pressing the muzzle against his chest. I don't think so, Governor, she said, her voice calm, cold, certain. After all these years of planning, I will not let either of you deny me the moment I have earned. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of Ruth's metamorphosis from grieving widow to calculating predator. She was no longer merely a poisoner. She was a strategist who had honed not just her methods of murder, but her understanding of human psychology and the vulnerabilities hidden even in the most powerful of men. You want the truth about your precious covenant of prosperity? Ruth asked, her pistol steady on Randolph, while her watchful eyes tracked Hale, who struggled to recover from the blinding attack. It was never a patriotic brotherhood cleansing Virginia of spies. It was a syndicate of opportunists, men who sold secrets to whichever side paid more, switching loyalties as easily as coats. You betrayed my husband, not because he endangered American liberty, but because he uncovered proof of your treason and prepared to expose you to both sides. Randolph's face drained of color. Impossible. Those records were destroyed long ago. Ruth's cold smile cut through him. Governor, you assume that grief made me careless, that love made me blind. But love made me relentless. I have spent 13 years tracking every record, every surviving witness, every hidden scrap of evidence. I know more about the covenant than any of its members ever dared admit to one another. Then came the revelation that would shake Virginia's fragile, post-revolutionary order. The covenant had not merely sold intelligence to the British, they had profited from treachery on both sides. They stole supplies meant for Washington's army, leaked strategies that cost American lives, and quietly eliminated rivals who threatened their monopoly on corruption. "My husband uncovered your scheme in 1779, Ruth," continued her voice, sharpened by memory. "Instead of denouncing you, he tried to use that knowledge. That was his mistake. You couldn't risk exposure and you couldn't silence him without suspicion. So you branded him a spy and delivered him to patriot justice, letting others do your killing, while you paraded as defenders of the cause." Captain Hale Vision, clearing through tears of pain, finally grasped the truth. His voice cracked. "Dear God, you weren't avenging loyalists at all. You were avenging the corruption that condemned your husband." Ruth inclined her head almost tenderly. "At last, Captain, you see. Jonathan was indeed a British agent, but he was also my husband and the father of the child I lost fleeing from his executioners. Your conspiracy destroyed not just him, but my life, my family, my very reason for existing. You forged me into the weapon I am." The portrait that emerged in those final moments was chilling. Ruth Holloway was no common murderer. She had spent 13 years dismantling an entire conspiracy piece by piece, guided by patience, intelligence, and an almost preternatural instinct for human weakness. She had not merely eliminated men, she had studied them, exploited their flaws, and engineered their downfalls, until each fell as predictably as a toppled domino. Desperate now, Randolph abandoned composure. "Mrs. Holloway, listen, spare me, and I will give you more than revenge. I can give you power. With my influence and your talents, we could control not just Virginia, but bend the federal government itself. Think of what we could rule together." Ruth's reply was quiet, but final. "Governor, you still cannot see. This was never about power or wealth or station. This was about love. Love for the man you murdered. Love for the life you stole. Love for justice which your corruption denied me. Power rots, as you have proven. But love endures, and love demands satisfaction." The closing moments unfolded with the inevitability of a trap long set. Every detail had been calculated, not only their deaths, but the appearance of inevitability surrounding them. By morning, when the servants entered the mansion, they found the lifeless bodies of Governor Edmund Randolph and Captain Jonathan Hale. The scene bore no trace of Ruth's hand, only the echoes of a reckoning, 13 years in the making. The scene that greeted the servants the following morning appeared to tell a clear and tragic tale. The library was in chaos furniture, overturned papers strewn across the carpet, glass glittering across the floor. Governor Randolph lay slumped against a chair, a bullet wound in his chest, while Captain Hale's pistol remained clenched in his stiffening hand. A few feet away, the captain's body sprawled near a shattered decanter, his face marred by chemical burns and his skull fractured from a brutal blow. To those who entered, it seemed undeniable the two men had engaged in a violent confrontation, and both had paid with their lives. The servants' horror deepened when they discovered Ruth Holloway, bound and gagged in a closet off the library. Freed from her restraints, she collapsed in apparent shock, trembling, unable at first to speak in coherent sentences. By the time Dr. Harrison arrived to examine the scene, Ruth's halting story was both heartbreaking and convincing. She explained through sobs that Captain Hale had arrived in a fevered state, hurling accusations at Governor Randolph and demanding that she testify to treasonous acts. Randolph had tried to calm him, but when Hale produced damning papers, the argument erupted into shouts. Then Captain Hale drew his pistol. Ruth whispered, her voice breaking. The governor tried to wrest it away. It went off, and then the glass, the fighting, I was thrown into the closet. After that, only silence. Dr. Harrison's observations supported her every word. The bullet, the burns, the shattered glass, all were consistent with her story. Ruth bore the marks of rough handling. Rope burns on her wrists and ankles, bruises that looked genuine. And who could believe that the genteel widow, so long pitied for her endless losses, could mastermind such brutality? The investigation that followed was perfunctory. With both men dead and Ruth's testimony aligning perfectly with the evidence, authorities concluded that Randolph and Hale had killed one another in a bitter quarrel over wartime corruption. The incriminating documents Hale had supposedly brought were found burned to ash in the fireplace, their secrets lost forever. What no one realized was that every piece of evidence had been engineered. The papers had been forged by Ruth months earlier, designed to lend credibility to a staged quarrel. The chemical that had blinded Hale was her own concoction, carefully chosen to mimic the injuries of an accident. Even her bruises and rope marks were self-inflicted products of techniques she had practiced to perfection. With the deaths of Randolph and Hale, the last members of the Covenant of Prosperity were gone. Ruth Holloway's 13-year campaign of vengeance had reached its conclusion. She had claimed justice, secured her fortune, and elevated herself to a position no one could question. In the months that followed, she withdrew from Richmond society, citing her declining health and the trauma of the terrible night. She sold her mansion and retired to an elegant but quieter home on the city's outskirts. Outwardly, she lived as a recluse attended only by a few trusted servants. Inwardly, she remained as calculating as ever. Though she no longer killed, Ruth's appetite for manipulation never waned. From behind the veil of respectability, she became a discreet but formidable broker of influence. With her wealth, her intimate knowledge of Virginia's elite, and her unflinching will, she shaped elections, business, rivalries, and social maneuverings for decades. She never remarried, claiming she had suffered too much loss to open her heart again. But her letters, her carefully cultivated friendships, and her silent leverage over powerful men allowed her to maintain a reach that extended far beyond her quiet estate. Only after her death in 1834, at the age of 80, did the full scope of her life emerge. Among her papers were meticulous records, every murder, every manipulation, every scheme. She had blackmailed officials, orchestrated the downfall of rivals, and destroyed reputations with the same precision she had once reserved for death. Most astonishing of all was her journal, written in a cipher so complex that it took months to crack. Within its pages, Ruth Holloway herself told the story of the grieving widow who had become the most formidable and perhaps most invisible criminal strategist in the history of the young republic. The journal revealed that Ruth's campaign against the covenant of prosperity had only been the opening act in a far darker career, one she described in her own hand as the work of an agent of necessary justice. She did not stop after dismantling that secret society. Instead, Ruth continued to identify and eliminate those she deemed unworthy of life. Over the years, she refined her methods until her presence at any crime scene became invisible. Her entries from the later decades reveal a woman utterly transformed by grief rage and time. The broken widow who had stumbled into Richmond in 1782 had evolved into something America had never seen before: a female crime lord who worked not for wealth, not for influence, but for her own twisted interpretation of moral order. "I have become something that perhaps God never intended to exist," she confessed in one of her final writings. "Yet, the corruption of this world has made me necessary. I am justice without law retribution, without mercy, order without government. I alone take upon myself the task of removing those whom society refuses to punish, and I do so without regret." The discovery of Ruth Holloway's journal, decades later, created a sensation among Virginia's elite. But it also raised an impossible question: what could be done about it? Many of the deaths she described were so distant in time that no investigation could ever be reopened. Other victims had been prominent names, pillars of the community whose reputations could not be dismantled without causing deep political fractures. And so, a quiet decision was made. The journal was sealed. The entire case was quietly marked a matter of state security. Ruth Holloway's story slipped into obscurity, hidden away in the vaults of the Virginia Historical Society, surfacing only occasionally in the private notes of historians digging through the post-revolutionary era. Yet, for those few who encountered her writings, the impression was unforgettable. Her crimes were chillingly methodical, her strategies psychologically advanced. Modern forensic specialists who have studied the case agree. Ruth Holloway was far ahead of her time in understanding how to kill without leaving a trace. Her arsenal included plant-based toxins, subtle enough to mimic natural illness, careful staging of crime scenes to mislead suspicion, and the creation of entire false identities that gave her perfect cover. Techniques that would not be matched until nearly 2 centuries later. But perhaps the most unsettling detail of all was not her skill as a murderer, but her mastery of perception. For over half a century, Ruth maintained the facade of a tragic figure, a widow deserving pity, a woman to be protected. All the while, she was one of the most prolific killers in American history. Her life proved a disturbing truth. The most dangerous criminals are not always those who lurk outside society, but those who learn to bend society to their will from the inside. Even today, her case continues to intrigue criminologists and psychologists alike. Ruth demonstrated how intelligence, patience, and the abandonment of conscience could allow a single person to undermine an entire system of justice. She became a blueprint for psychological manipulation and systematic murder, one that criminals have drawn from ever since. Her life forces us to ask, how far can grief and vengeance transform a person? What do we really see when we look at those around us? Ruth Holloway's story is a chilling reminder that beneath even the most refined surface, something monstrous may be waiting. So, what do you think? Could someone truly carry out such a long, hidden campaign of revenge? Could Ruth have done the same in today's world, or would modern forensic science have caught her sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this tale and want more stories where history itself seems darker than any fiction, don't forget to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves unsettling mysteries. Until next time, remember, the predators we should fear most are often those who appear the most civilized. And the greatest crimes are the ones history chooses not to remember.